Welcome back, everybody. Tonight we're going to be doing assignment number 10, lesson number 10 on your YouTube portion. And we're going to be talking about personality theory. Now, personality theory basically is an explanation about how your personality gets formulated. And different branches of psychology believe very much that there are differences in the way our personalities form. And so we're going to talk about some research on involving a number of different approaches. This week we're going to talk about the trait theorists and the psychodynamic theorists and how they approach it. So when we define personality, Gordon Allport, who is a big member of the trait theorist camp, defined it as a dynamic organization within the individual of the psychophysical systems that determine unique adjustments to the environment. A better way of, or a more succinct way of putting it by Walter Mischel was distinct patterns of behavior across different situations. So either way you talk about it, that's sort of our working definitions for personality. So the trait theorists really are theorists that looked at people's individual characteristics. Think of it as pieces of a puzzle. And by putting all the individual traits together, the trait theorists believed they could give you a complete puzzle. So, these traits, the theorist began with Allport's approach, and he listed about 18,000 different traits. And then he defined different levels of traits. So he had three categories of traits that were very important to his theory. The first one is the cardinal trait, right? The cardinal trait is a dominant trait, and it's pervasive over everything that you do. So a cardinal trait would be like Lincoln was known for his honesty, Honest Abe, right? And so when you talk about Lincoln, you would say his cardinal trait would be his honesty. So there are very few of them within an individual that guide the principles of most of their lives. The second category, according to Allport, is the central trait. And these are the basic building blocks of personality. Those are the traits that talk about whether you're someone who is independent or who's someone who needs guidance, someone who is generally positive in their approach, or someone who is more negative, pessimistic in their approach. Those would be your central traits. And then finally, you have your secondary traits. Your secondary traits, according to Allport, are the relatively trivial ones like color preferences, and maybe political leanings, things along those lines. So those are the categories of traits that Allport looked at, and so they define the trait as lasting qualities within a person which are inferred from the observed behavior that you can get. So from these traits, you get a profile of what the person's personality looked like, how they evolved. And utilizing this approach, the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, say that 4 times fast, was a test that was formulated by Allport's followers. And this drew up a lot of different traits, about over 500 traits, and gave you a rating for what type of person you were seeing given that collection of traits. And how do you get that? Well, over a long period of time, thousands of people have taken the MMPI exam, and so now we have data to compare those people to. So it acts as a good sort of predictor of certain personality traits. Like if you take the police exam or the fireman's exam, they have subscales within the MMPI that talk about your level of honesty or your propensity for violence, things along those lines. So they would probably use that for the applications if you're one of those people that have taken the police exam. So that's one type of testing, right? And that is more of an objective test, right? Because you compare scores to something. Then there are subjective personality tests, or things that are used for interpretation, right? Things like the Rorschach exam. That's those ink blots that you see that, you say, what does this look like? And using the answers, the psychologist tries to get patterns of responses to talk about the person's personality. We call this subjective test because it's the person who's interpreting it, the psychologist, will interpret the findings and come up with a subjective interpretation of that person's personality. That's known as a projective test. We can project into the person's mind by examining their problem-solving processes, or what they project onto the Rorschach images. There are other ones like that. The thematic apperception test, the TAT, shows an image, and then you're supposed to interpret that neutral image to get an idea of how you interpret personality, right? So, and also we see tests like finish the sentence, complete a sentence, where you're given sort of a vague sentence like "I am happiest when," and then you give the answer to that question. And using that type of data, the psychologist comes up with a picture of the person that they're doing sort of from a subjective point of view, right? So that's trait theorists in a nutshell. There are a lot of people who still use the trait approach to try to put together a profile. There are lots of different personality inventories that are used by occupation, different occupations, to try to predict how a person's going to perform within a job, specific job position. So that is a very useful area, right? So now we're going to move on to talk about psychodynamic personality theory, right? And this is where Freud comes in. And you know, Freud was a very interesting guy. Freud was around in the mid to late 1800s. That's when he was doing his studies. He was a Austrian psychiatrist, and he was studying psychotherapy. He came up with a lot of these theories using his case studies of different patients that he had. Many of his patients were women who he called neurotic. Many of these women were a product of their time. They were subject of many times incest and sexual abuse. And they would tell Freud about this, and sometimes Freud misinterpreted this as something that they wished for. But as he went on, he kind of grew with the theory. So anyway, Freud's psychoanalytic theory was laughed at when he first came out with it because it was so radical. He proposed the idea that somehow that things that happen to us at 0 to 1 years of age would affect our adult behavior. And at the time when he proposed this, again, many of his peers said this couldn't be so. And Freud went on to show down the road that through his theories and through the studies of others, that in fact it is very important how we form attachments 0 to 1 years of age. And if those attachments are not formulated properly, it turns out it does affect us in adulthood and our relationships. So that was something that Freud predicted. There were several other things that we carry on that Freud brought us, but some of these things have been modified as you go along, but certainly Freud is still thought about today because many of his theories remain important and certainly, at least you would say, influential within psychology. So Freud, formulated this approach, psychodynamic approach to personality. And a lot of his theories came about, as I said, in the late 1800s, and he sort of continued on until the late 1930s. And he viewed personality as a dynamic system that were directed by 3 mental structures within the mind. These theoretical structures, he said they were the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay, 3 theoretical structures. The id, he proposed, was sort of the innate biological instincts that live within us. The id is very self-serving. It's irrational. It's impulsive. And it operates totally on the unconscious level. So that is, it drives our behavior and operates solely on the pleasure principle. And what that means is the id, without reason within us, is seeking out pleasure at any cost. Right? So he's sort of like the picture of the little devil sitting on your shoulder saying, go ahead and do it. It's okay. Fine. It's fine. Do it. So the id, Freud thought that the id was the well of energy that drove us, right? And within that, there were 2 things that really drove us. One was our libido, right? And that promotes our survival instinct, eros, or erotic. And that was the underlying sexual instincts that sought us to seek sexual contact all the time. So that's the libido lives within the id. And also the death instinct or the tendency toward violence lives within the id, according to Freud, and that was known as thanatos. And within that are destructive and aggressive urges, right? And the Freud says we're ruled by our sex and aggressive instincts. Now, again, that was a radical statement at the time, but if you think about what sells, what's in the movies these days, right? What's on commercials? What sells? We know that sex sells and violence sells. So I'm going to say that Freud might have been happy about the way he assessed our unconscious id, right? So the id is serving to push us toward these instincts that we have, according to Freud. The ego is the second part that he proposes of our personality. The ego directs the energies that are supplied by the id, and it is guided instead of the pleasure principle by the reality principle. That is to say, it tries to delay our gratification until it's more appropriate. So a little bit of the ego operates on the conscious level, dealing with the real world. And because of that, the ego tries to control the id's energy and tamp it down so that it comes out at a more appropriate time, right? So that's what the ego is constantly trying to do, constantly trying to balance the energy from the id. And also the superego is involved in influencing the ego. The superego acts as judge or censor for the actions of the ego. So it's on the unconscious part of our personality, and the conscience is a part of the superego, right? That's the thing that says, ooh, really, I shouldn't be doing this, or you should be doing something else. The ego ideal also lives within the superego. The ego ideal, it reflects parentally approved behavior, like what your parents would approve of. And we know that personalities that Freud told us that personalities that have a weak superego tend to have more delinquent and behavior and social and personal instincts that are controlled by the id. The overly strong superego, we see people that live with inhibition and guilt all the time, feeling as if they can't enjoy themselves because it might violate the tenets of the superego, right? So all these processes kind of try to influence the ego to have influence, and sometimes the superego wins out, sometimes the ego wins out, sometimes the id wins out. And so we're constantly, according to Freud, in conflict because of the different factions of our personality. So Freud used this approach, this psychosexual development approach, to formulate a developmental theory. And there were some very important things about his theory. The thing about his theory was it was the first stage theory. That is, a stage theory proposes that all children go through the same stages, maybe at different paces, but they go through the same stages. And because of that, they're subject to the same influences as they go through those stages. This was the first stage theory that was proposed. So Freud theorized that the core of personality is formed before the age of 6. Think about that. Before the age of 6, most of your personality is formed, according to Freud. And he believed that at each stage, the body changes the child's primary erogenous or pleasure zone. Freud believed that many adult personality traits can be traced to fixations that is not getting through one of these psychosexual stages. So I'm going to give you a basic primer on the psychosexual stages. The first one is the oral stage, 0 to 1 years of age. Most early stimulation comes from the mouth, putting everything, including the fingers, the feet, the breast, everything into the mouth. And adult expressions of this, where you haven't come through your oral stage completely resolved, adult expressions would be smoking, nail biting, overeating, alcoholism, anything to do with intake into the mouth, right? So getting fixated in that stage can lead to these behaviors. The second stage Freud proposes is the anal stage, from approximately 1 to 3 years of age. During this time, the child's attention shifts to the process of elimination. It's focused on the anal stage. Toilet training becomes the key issue during this stage that they have to resolve. They're being asked to control something in their life for the first time, control their bowels. And so because of that, a couple of things can result in terms of fixation at this stage. You can have an anal retentive personality. That's someone who gets toilet trained either too early or too harshly. That type of person becomes obstinate, stingy, and compulsively clean. right? Because they're tortured in their process of toilet training. The opposite of that is the anal expulsive personality, right? That's the person who is disorderly and destructive and messy. That's a person who goes too long without being asked to toilet train, and so they become the anal expulsive personality, right? The third stage of Freud's proposed psychosexual development is the most important stage because it's the phallic stage. Between 3 to 6 years of age, something very important happens, according to Freud, from a sexual growth standpoint. There's increased sexual interest, which causes the child to be physically attracted to the opposite sex parent. This is the time during Freud which he proposes the Oedipal conflict. Oedipal conflict, named after a character in Shakespeare, is when boys feel a rivalry with the father for the mother's affection, right? During that time, they feel a rivalry. And the young boy feels that he's threatened by the father, and he has a fear of castration during this time. That is to say that the child feels vulnerable to the father, feels a rivalry, and feels like they might be castrated by the father. So in order to resolve this, the boy must then identify again with the father as more likable and want to be more like the father rather than see them as a rival. So there is a comparable conflict for the girls called the Electra conflict, where girls are, according to Freud, attracted to the father for a period of time. But Freud, because he's a product of his time, doesn't believe that the Electra conflict is quite as pronounced as the Oedipal conflict, right? He feels that the male psychosexual development is far more pronounced during this time. Later, other neo-Freudians try to prove him wrong. At any rate, the Electra conflict is for girls to be attracted to the father, and they also have to resolve it according to Freud, right? So, unresolved, you might find someone, a male, seeking out a relationship if they don't resolve with a person that's older than them or like their mother, mothering of them in a relationship. And in a girl, if they're not resolved, you might see them looking for a father figure in a relationship, right? That's how it would play out. The fourth stage is actually a non-stage. It's called latency, from 6 to 12. Freud proposes that psychosexual development is interrupted for development of, peer type of friendships, sort of same-sex interaction, and it's kind of put on hold. Many people argue with this as a stage, say it's impossible to just put development on hold, but that's a criticism of this. And then finally, Freud proposes for the fifth stage, the genital stage, where sexual interest reemerges at about age 12. And this happens at the time of puberty and goes forward. There's an upswing in sexual energies, a growing capacity for mature sexual relationships, and it's a time of turmoil, of emotion, and it resolves with it ending in proper heterosexual love. I say that because during Freud's time, homosexuality would have been thought of as a disorder, right? So now we know it's not, but at that time it would have been considered that way. So he says it ends in heterosexual, full adult sexuality. And if you get stuck in this stage, you cannot move on to a mature relationship. So these are Freudian concepts. This is his proposed theory of development. I did want to mention the Neo-Freudians again. There's a few Neo-Freudians that took some of Freud's theories or techniques and then modified them to accent different things. These are important because they were prominent in developing psychoanalytic theory, even though it wasn't the same as Freud, same accent as Freud's original theory. So Adler was around, he was a peer of Freud around during the same time, and he believed in the stage theory. He liked that part. But he believed that, humans kept striving for superiority, and that he disagreed with the emphasis on the unconsciousness. He felt that we did have some conscious influence of our own behavior, so he didn't believe in Freud in that. And he also thought that we were, there was a driving force of wanting to sort of relate to others in our personality in a social manner. So it wasn't just a psychosexual development. The next Neo-Freudian I wanted to mention was Karen Horney. Karen Horney was around into the mid-50s. She still has an institute in New York. She was considered neo-Freudian. She liked a lot of Freud's ideas, but she was sort of a feminist, if you will. She's the one that said, listen, not only do I disagree with Freud, electroconflict is equally as important, and a lot of women do seek out a father figure. That was number one. But she also said that she didn't agree with the concept of penis envy, that women envied males just because they had the penis. She, in fact, said, no, males are jealous of females because of the fact that they are able to give birth, give life. So she disagreed with Freud in that sense of the word. And finally, I wanted to mention Carl Jung. Carl Jung was sort of carried over some of Freud's ideas, but he believed in the balance of conscious and unconscious rather than unconscious playing such a thorough role. He thought that all humans had common experiences since the beginning of time with death and life and energy and animals, and that we all respond to symbols of these experiences. There's sort of a collective consciousness, right? And Jung proposed that we become happier and healthier when we strike a balance between our conscious life, our present, and our unconscious life, what's come in the past, right? So he was a little different than Freud in some senses, disagreed with him on some things, but also agreed with Freud in terms of the stage theories, and that's very important. All right, finally, I want to also talk to you about one last thing about Freud, which stays with us, which is defense mechanisms, right? Defense mechanisms are used, they're unconscious things that emerge for us when we get overloaded with guilt and anxiety, right? So they help us to get through our daily lives. Because if we responded to everything in such a raw manner, like totally responded to everything, we'd be overwhelmed. So instead of that, we, according to Freud, we developed this response to overwhelming anxiety called defense mechanisms. Now, you're going to recognize some of these, right? Because we use them all the time. And Freud basically said that a healthy amount of use of defense mechanisms, that helps us to stay balanced. But when we overuse defense mechanisms, then we might not realize eventually whether we're responding to what's real or what's defense, you know. So overuse of defense mechanisms probably is not a good thing either. Anyway, let me give you some specific ones, right? So first one is repression. Repression is pushing down your feelings, right, into your subconscious. So you know it's something there that bothers you. You probably should deal with it, but you don't want to, so you push it down. That's called repression. And what happens is when you repress things too much, suddenly things start to slip through, and it creates anxiety. You don't know why you're anxious, but you are. Unfortunately, this leads to anxiety attacks. That's why using a lot of repression can be bad. Second one I wanted to tell you about was reaction formation. Reaction formation is a reversal of motives, right? You unconsciously harbor the exact opposite feeling from how you're acting. So, let's say someone is very promiscuous sexually, right? And she doesn't like the fact that she's very promiscuous and has these feelings, so instead she decides to become a nun. Right? Her behavior is the opposite of the true feelings that she's harboring, right? So that's reaction formation. The classic example of this is when somebody is a gay basher, right? They hear about homosexuals and they have a very aggressive attitude because they themselves are harboring homosexual feelings and can't deal with them, so they become aggressive. That's what's called reaction formation, right? Projection. Think about projection. Blaming others for our own feelings, right? When we're the ones who have feelings, right, we want to shift our own unwanted motives onto others. It's like calling the kettle black, right? So in an argument, you're constantly hearing somebody say, you're selfish, you're very, very selfish, when in fact, in the argument, you can see that the other person is actually the one that's selfish, right? Because we like to project our own bad feelings to other people and try to cope with it that way. How about rationalization? How often do you use this, right? When you use rationalization, you substitute an acceptable conscious motive for an unacceptable unconscious motive, right? So you're not giving the real reason you're doing something, but you want to come across sounding better, so you rationalize, right? It's like when I told my wife, I don't want to go to Thanksgiving for your aunt because, you know, it's too far and you'll be too tired the next day. But really, the reason was her cooking stinks. That's why I didn't want to go. So I just rationalized and said, nah, we'll save you the drive and you won't be so tired, right? So those are the some of the defense mechanisms that I wanted to regale you with. There are a lot of others. There's a denial, right? Denial where you just you don't want to deal with something. So instead of even bothering to push it down, you just say, no, it isn't true. I did not lose the election. That's not true. Denial, right? So that's a defense mechanism. And there are, several others where you use regression, right? Regression is when you use a baby voice. Oh, I'm so sorry. I regress into being a child, childlike, so that the person actually doesn't get very angry at you just because you're playing childlike behavior. So defense mechanisms are things that we use all the time. Remember, Freud did not propose that the use of all defense mechanisms was bad, but he did say overuse is not too good. One of the things you'll pick up from Freud as you look at his theories in the book is that he didn't have a very positive or constructive notion about human existence. He thought we were constantly in turmoil with ourselves and we were driven by very animalistic instincts. You decide. Next tape, you'll see that we're going to talk about some other approaches to personality, like behavioral and humanistic theories. See you then.